Are we fighting World War III right now? Not only are we fighting it, it started in 2014. I first admitted to this back in March of 2022, 1 month after Russia invaded Ukraine. A no-fly zone might be a moral imperative, but we have to be aware of the consequences that will happen day one. We also have to understand that World War III may have already started and we're just delaying the inevitable. And I touched on it again when I went on the Destiny podcast, and I touched on it again when I went on Sebastian Gorka's radio show, where I said...
Are you kind of fed up, Ryan, with the World War III is about to begin crowd? Because this has been a drumbeat for months now.
So I'm actually of the opinion that World War III began 2 years ago.
Ooh, okay.
It began when Russia invaded Ukraine.
Interesting. Expand.
Absolutely. So I could even go back even further and say that it probably started in 2014 when President Obama did not stand up to
the Crimea invasion.
To the Crimea invasion. Now, if all this talk of World War III makes you want to pull out your hair, have I got the solution for you. You know, I started shaving my head back when I was an infantry platoon sergeant. It was just easier that way. Then I got out and I started working as a software engineer, started growing out my hair. Now, probably about 2 years ago, I noticed this. Now, I'm balding, but I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to fight my genetics, and now you can too. You know, male pattern baldness affects 2 out of every 3 guys by the time they're 35. It got me. But Keeps helps you get professional care for hair loss from the comfort of your own home without ever visiting a doctor's office or pharmacy. And it's shipped discreetly to your door. So head over to keeps.com/Ryan McBeth to get a special offer. Complete an online consultation to get matched with a provider who'll tailor a treatment plan, if medically appropriate, to address your hair loss concerns. All treatment plans are personalized to address your unique needs and recommended by a licensed medical provider, specially trained in hair loss. And you can cancel your plan at any time. Keeps also offers hair thickening shampoo, conditioner, and styling pomade. These products work together to complete the treatment plan. And most men notice results within about 6 months of starting treatment. Thanks to Keeps for sponsoring this video and for the free product. Head over to keeps.com/Ryan McBeth to get a special offer. Individual results may vary. Now let's get back to talking about World War III. Now, in order to understand World War III, I want to talk about World War I and World War II. World War I, then almost universally known as the Great War or the World War, started on August 1st, 1914, when Germany declared war on Russia, and then 2 days later on France. But it had its roots going back 2 months previously to the June 28th assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. You could even say that the seeds were sown back in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War, when France lost its territory of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany. So what were the primary features of the First World War? Well, it featured multiple actors and theaters of war. It introduced new weapon systems like the submarine and poison gas. Featured economic warfare waged using blockades, sanctions, and contraband lists, and all sides used propaganda to justify their involvement. With World War II, which at the time was often just called the War, or in the Soviet Union and modern-day Russia, the Great Patriotic War, that started on September 3rd, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. America entered the war on December 8th, 1941, after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, but Europe had already been fighting for 2 years, and technically there was fighting going on in Asia for 4 years. So you could say that the seeds of the European conflict go all the way back to World War I, when the Treaty of Versailles tried to hobble and humiliate the Germans. So what were the main features of World War II? You had multiple actors and theaters of war, new weapon systems like strategic bombing and ballistic missiles, global economic warfare using blockades, sanctions, contraband lists, and who can forget the propaganda. Now, it wasn't until late 1944 that Americans started calling World War II World War II. In fact, my copy of the Pictorial History of World War II has a copyright date of 1944. It was being written as the war was still underway. Now, the first use of the term World War III can be found in this issue of Time magazine from November 3rd, 1941. You see, Germany had pushed the UK across the English Channel in 1940, and the two sides just kind of glared at each other while Germany invaded Russia and Yugoslavia and Greece while simultaneously bombing London. But one could say that the war was technically over. So it was thought that Germany would get bogged down in Russia and then try to establish some kind of peace as it built up their navy for the next fight. So some people thought that World War II was already finished, and World War III would be that great push into Europe. The term World War III pops up in the New York Times on February 10, 1945, from an anti-war group known as the Society for the Prevention of World War III. Here they warn that a Soviet-backed coalition of self-proclaimed anti-national socialists made up of former German officers should not be recognized as part of the legitimate German Reconstruction government. So, the term was used with the assumption that there would be a Third World War with Germany as the aggressor again. And in another article, this time on May 2nd, talks about how Stalin was the only real victor in Asia, and that makes World War III over Russian domination of Asia an almost certainty. Then on October 9th, 1945, General George S. Patton claimed that another war was inevitable. Although he refused to speculate with whom and when, it would probably be started by a madman who claimed outrage. Sound familiar? By December 7th, 1945, General Hap Arnold, the man who devised a strategic bombing campaign over Germany and Japan, advocated that the North Pole would be important in the next Great War. And keep in mind that back then, nuclear weapons were delivered by bombers, and the shortest route to the Soviet Union was over the North Pole. So, the specter of World War III has been around since the end of World War II, although it implied conventional conflict. The first associations with nuclear weapons came in 1950 when the Daily Worker, a local Chicago communist newspaper, accused President Harry S. Truman of trying to convert the conflict in Korea into World War III. Funny thing, the actual article ends with the words, "Hands off Korea, Korea for the Korean people and America for the American people, end the lockout of China and the USSR and the United Nations, outlaw the atom bomb, prevent World War III." You can see how something like this could be a tweet today. The words and accusations haven't even changed. By 1953, atomic scientists were warning that the Soviet Union had about 50 or so atomic weapons and World War III was most probable. The 1950s saw the advent of popular novels like Tomorrow and On the Beach and Alas, Babylon. And now, the notion of World War III and nuclear weapons were firmly entrenched in the public psyche. So let's look at the conflict in Ukraine. Some people say that the conflict started on February 24th, 2022, but not if you're Ukrainian. To understand the gravity of this claim, we must revisit the events of 2014. And that year started with Ukraine in turmoil. The Euromaidan protests led to the ouster of President Viktor Yanukovych, a move that Russia saw as a direct threat to its influence in the region. In response, Russian troops in unmarked uniforms moved into Crimea, seizing control of key infrastructure and government buildings. Following Crimea, the conflict spread to eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, where pro-Russian separatists, essentially supported by Moscow, engaged in a brutal war against Ukrainian forces. The war resulted in thousands of deaths and has displaced millions. So you could even say that World War III happened in Crimea back in 2014 when Russia took Crimea by force and the world responded with a shrug, maybe a couple of sanctions. Everything but a gun. So what are the features of this current war? How does it match up to World War I and World War II? Well, we have multiple actors, essentially a coalition of the West versus Russia, Iran, China, and in some cases North Korea. Although we don't really have multiple theaters, we do have 4 overseas theaters that are active 24/7 watching over this stuff: CENTCOM, Eurocom, AFRICOM, and SOUTHCOM. War is not just being fought on the land domain and the sea domain and in the air, but in cyberspace and in the information domain through pro-Russian influencers. We've seen new weapons like drones and loitering munitions, and of course you've seen economic warfare using blockades, sanctions, and contraband lists. And who can forget the propaganda? the 24/7 propaganda that spills out of computers into the brains of people who are terminally online. Now, nobody would argue that land warfare is a domain of warfare. It's been the case since the first caveman picked up the first spear and said, you know what? I really don't like how Thag is always in charge. And we fought on the sea since the Peloponnesian War. Air has been a domain of combat since World War I. You could even make the argument that space has been a domain of warfare ever since the first Gulf War, when the U.S. was able to navigate the uncrossable desert of Iraq due to GPS satellites. Cyber has been a domain of warfare since 2007, when Estonia moved a bronze statue of a Soviet soldier from the center of the city of Tallinn to a World War II military cemetery. And Russia's response was a massive denial of service attack on Estonia's internet infrastructure. Today, as I speak, Russia is conducting influence operations to convince you that Ukraine is not worth supporting. Information war is a domain of warfare that weaves its way through all the other domains. So you can certainly say that we are at war with Russia right now. Russia is fighting against the minds of the American people. It is a war to divide us, a war to convince you that standing up to the bear will cause World War III that we see in the movies. When if you look at the information domain, we're already at war. We're already at war with Russia. You know, I read this book, Nuclear War by Annie Jacobsen, and the book left me feeling very afraid. Not that there was going to be a nuclear war, but because our idea of World War III and nuclear war is so intertwined that the book could be used by Russia to threaten the West. As in, like, don't stand up to Russia because what if Russia goes nuclear? So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what go nuclear would actually look like. What advantage does a nuclear weapon give an adversary? Now, back in the 1960s, the battlefield use of nuclear weapons made sense. We really didn't have the kind of precision-guided weapons that could, let's say, take out a bridge. So if the Soviets were advancing and we needed to drop a bridge, yeah, a nuclear weapon delivered by a fighter made sense because you didn't have to be that surgical. But today, on the modern battlefield, nuclear weapons are really only good for about 5 things. Nuclear weapons can be used to create a gap in enemy defenses that the enemy would then push through the gap to break through. Nuclear weapons could be used to stop an advance of an enemy force. Nuclear weapons could be a good choice for destroying a command bunker that is really deep underground. Nuclear weapons would be a good choice for destroying an aircraft carrier battle group. And nuclear weapons would be a good choice for destroying an amphibious landing or a major river crossing. So let's look at all those options. Could Russia use a nuclear weapon against Ukrainian lines to create a breakthrough? Probably not. The ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance systems are so good that any buildup of troops would be very difficult to hide. And you need that massing of troops because you want to be able to break through and then sustain that breakthrough. And right now, massing anything more than a company of troops or armored vehicles puts you at an incredible visual, thermal, and signal signature, which would be detected, and these vehicles would be destroyed through precision fires. So, could Russia use a nuclear weapon against advancing Ukrainian forces if they broke through Russian lines and tried to cut off Crimea? Again, probably not. Ukraine suffers from the same problem as Russia. They just can't mass troops without being detected, and you've seen how hard it is for Ukraine to make a breakthrough. So could Russia use a nuclear weapon on a Ukrainian underground command bunker? Again, probably not. Now, when I say underground command center, I'm talking about like NORAD in Cheyenne Mountain or the Hang Seng Military Command Center in Taiwan. That kind of target for command and control just isn't really a valid case because it doesn't really exist in Ukraine. So could Russia use a nuclear weapon against a Ukrainian naval battle group? Well, Ukraine doesn't have a navy. And that makes my whole point about using a nuclear weapon to stop a beachhead on an amphibious landing kind of moot as well. So there's really no tactical reason to use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. Now, if NATO intervened, could some of those use cases become valid? Maybe. But the one thing people tend to forget is that NATO has nuclear weapons too. And President Vladimir Putin knows that any nuclear weapons used by Russia would almost guarantee the use of nuclear weapons from NATO. Dictators tend to want to stay in power. And nuclear conflict, even if it's limited to battlefield use, could see the end of President Putin as a leader. I'll give you one more possible scenario. The People's Republic of China certainly may have warned President Putin not to use a nuclear weapon because it could set a precedent. Remember that last use case for a nuclear weapon, where a nuclear weapon could be used to stop an amphibious landing force? Well, if China decided to invade Taiwan, they are going to have a heck of a beachhead with a long supply line. So they probably aren't too keen on the normalization of tactical nuclear weapons. So are we fighting World War III right now? In many ways, yes. The conflict in Ukraine shares many features with the world wars of the past. Multiple actors, new weapon systems, economic warfare, pervasive propaganda. The battles are not just fought with guns and missiles, but with information and influence. The seeds of this war were sown long ago with the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and subsequently the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And the West's response has largely been economic and diplomatic, avoiding direct military confrontation. But we're still at war. The use of nuclear weapons is unlikely, given the strategic and political implications. A modern battlefield and global political landscape makes such a decision fraught with peril for any nation, including Russia. We're in a new kind of war, one that's fought in cyberspace and through the media instead of just on the ground. The aim is to influence minds and shape perceptions, divide and conquer through misinformation and fear. Thank you guys for watching.
It's me, Captain Bannon of the documentary Team Yankee. When I'm not kicking commie butts, I'm wearing t-shirts from Ryan Macbeth available at Bunker Branding, Knife Hands, HIMARS, Landmines, Patriot, and even my favorite, the TOW missile. Mushna, we want t-shirt too! Take a hike, commie! So come on down to Bunker Branding and take a stand for what's really important about America. Capitalism!